Welcome to this presentation titled Alexander Hamilton, Architect of the U.S. Mixed Economy. I am Edward J. Dodson. Alexander Hamilton played a central role in the establishment of laws governing the financial and economic affairs of the new United States of America. What follows is a story of his intellectual development, his guiding philosophical principles, and his rise from obscurity. Thanks in no small part to Hamilton's influence, the nation began its existence with a mixed economy. Government from that point on would always have a strong role to play in how wealth is produced and to whom wealth is distributed. An excellent biography of Alexander Hamilton was produced by Broadus Mitchell and published in 1976. Mitchell, a professor of economics, conveyed to readers the significance of Hamilton's contributions to the establishment of the nation's first political and economic institutions and setting the course of history for later generations in the United States of America. Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury, was an artillerist in the early part of the American Revolution. It is appropriate, therefore, to speak of his trajectory, not of cannonballs, but of policies for his country. His proposals describe today's economic and political developments. He rejected the agrarian society, which his opponents favored, and he urged a combination of farming, finance, industry, and commerce. He would bring about these varied pursuits by concerted effort. Another examination of Hamilton's contributions by Richard Brookhiser describes Hamilton's continued influence on matters of fundamental importance to how policymakers in the United States continue to respond to a world of unforeseen challenges. Hamilton's life is a mirror for politics as well as morality, for public as well as private life. We cannot always find the specific policies of today reflected in it, though some issues he dealt with remain current, trade, taxes, and others have faded. Hamilton's positions fit no current political model. Modern conservatives would distrust his trust in government. Modern liberals would find him lacking in compassion. One reason he wanted federal taxes was to make the poor work. But Hamilton's methods and his goals are always news. How to appeal to citizens and what they need in order to fulfill themselves will be matters of concern and dispute as long as America lasts. Another historian, Claude Bowers, spent an entire book examining the parallels and ideological differences between Hamilton and Jefferson. One important observation he makes about Hamilton is an observation one is still able to make regarding the positions held by those who aspire to high levels of influence and authority over our socio-political arrangements and institutions. He writes, "His ideal of government was the rule of gentlemen, the domination of aristocrats, on the theory that these, with a certain prestige to maintain, were more jealous of their honor and above the vulgar strivings for mere place. Thus it was impossible for him to conceive of a strong and capable government over which the aristocracy did not have sway." In 2019, the public historian Nancy Braden Spanis added her analysis of Hamilton to those mentioned above. She details how Hamilton orchestrated the early design of the American system. She writes, "It is beyond question that he supplied the spark of revolutionary genius, the ideas, combined with nearly unbelievable energy, that were crucial in creating the United States Republic and its unique and successful but now nearly abandoned American system of political economy." Well, let's take a look at Alexander's life. He was born in 1755 on the West Indies island of Nevis. His parents separated when he was still quite young, leaving his mother to find a way of providing for Alexander and his brother James. She had inherited at least 3 enslaved women when her own mother died, so she hired the services of these women out to others in order to generate some income. She also opened a small shop, which she managed for a few years until struck down with a fever, dying in February of 1768. Interestingly, one of the few possessions recorded as coming to the two boys was a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince. When their appointed guardian died in the summer of 1769, James was apprenticed to a carpenter, and Alexander began working as a clerk in the business owned by Nicholas Kruger, operating out of the port city of Christiansted. To this point, his learning had occurred in the home, yet he spoke and wrote clearly in both English and French. While still quite young, he took on significant responsibilities, dealing with merchants, planters, sea captains, lawyers, government officials. Further evidence of Alexander's abilities is that Nicholas Kruger left him in charge of the business while away on a business trip to New York from August 1771 to July 1772. Alexander was not yet 17 years of age. A destructive hurricane hit the island of St. Croix at the end of August 1772. Alexander described the devastation in a letter to his father, which found its way into the Royal Danish American Gazette. The island's Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Hugh Knox, who had become something of an intellectual companion to Alexander, worked to raise the funds necessary to send the young man to the mainland to acquire a formal education. The first ship headed for the mainland colony sailed to Boston. Alexander arrived in the midst of the rising resistance to British authority. That November, Sam Adams would head a 21-member committee of correspondence to communicate with other towns and colonies. This was followed by Boston citizens endorsing 3 radical proclamations asserting the rights of the colonists to self-rule. From Boston, Alexander made his way to New York City and the counting house of Courtwright and Company, associates of Nicholas Kruger, who provided him with accommodations for a few days, after which he moved on to Elizabethtown, New Jersey, where he was enrolled in the local academy to study for application to college. He would spend a year at the academy before moving to New York to attend King's College, although his first choice was to attend Princeton. However, Princeton's trustees rejected his proposal for an accelerated program of independent study. Although King's College was governed by a staunch monarchist in the person of Miles Cooper, Broadus Mitchell concludes that New York offered many more benefits to Alexander than were available at Princeton. New York was a better base for his future operations and influence, for New York's resources were greater and its geographical situation was superior for a champion of national unity. At this point in his life, Alexander was looking to medicine as his likely profession. He proved to be a very disciplined student, mastering mathematics in addition to the physical sciences. He joined a college writing and debating club and absorbed the works of Locke, Montesquieu, and other great political theorists and political economists. As Britain's North American colonists began to resist royal prerogatives and the imposition of new taxes, Alexander put his own assessment of the situation into a series of anonymous pamphlets that were widely read and circulated. While still a student, he also contributed articles on political issues to New York newspapers. In what is recorded as his first public and very impromptu address to a gathering of New Yorkers in an open field, Broadus Mitchell records that Alexander reinforced the resolves that denounced the act closing the port of Boston, cried out against unconstitutional parliamentary taxes, and called for an embargo on imports from and exports to Britain until grievances were redressed. Alexander was now fully engaged in the Republican uprising, responding in writing to much older loyalist defenders of the status quo. At the same time, he personally intervened to protect Miles Cooper from harm threatened by a mob of self-proclaimed anti-loyalists. Cooper made his escape to a British warship and on to England. Young Alexander boldly stepped forward as leaders in each colony debated whether and how to respond to events then unfolding. On the 26th of November, 1775, he wrote to John Jay, who was serving as a New York delegate to the Continental Congress. Alexander raised concerns over actions taken by New England troops against New York citizens professing loyalty to the crown. He wrote, "In times of such commotion as the present, while the passions of men are worked up to an uncommon pitch, there is great danger of fatal extremes. The same state of the passions which fits the multitude, who have not a sufficient stock of reason and knowledge to guide them, for opposition to tyranny and oppression, very naturally leads them to a contempt and disregard of all authority." Earlier in the year, Alexander had withdrawn from King's College and joined a volunteer military company. His company was instrumental in removing the cannon from Fort George to a place of relative safety. In March of 1776, he was commissioned a captain in the New York Provincial Company of Artillery. His company joined many others in preparing for the defense of New York. During the early phase of the war, Alexander carried out his duties commanding artillery at Long Island, Harlem Heights, White Plains, Trenton, and Princeton. Even with the outcome of the war far from certain, Alexander was thinking about what sort of systemic changes ought to be pursued. He absorbed ideas contained in articles by Malachi Postlethwaite in the Universal Dictionary of Trade and Commerce. Postlethwaite embraced the mercantilist principles associated with the managed economy, but also incorporated some of the perspectives put forward in France by the school of political economists known as physiocrats, and by the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. The theoretical arguments for the mixed economy were forming in his mind as he studied these works. What, he asked himself, were the appropriate limits to individual freedom of action? Where was the appropriate political location for the exercise of authority? To what extent is popular expression a valid basis for law and public policy? For answers, he looked to the writings of Plutarch as a major source of inspiration, as explained by Philip Shadler. Monarchy and the institutions that limited it were a major focus of Hamilton's attention. Plutarch's presentation of the four kings, who are the subjects of these lives, explores four different types of monarchy, from democratic to absolute, from martial to peaceable, and reviews their achievements and flaws. Hamilton picks out the diverse threads. On the 1st of March, 1777, Alexander was promoted to lieutenant colonel and brought into Washington's inner circle as his aide-de-camp. There is some speculation that he had been put forward by General Nathanael Greene, who had observed the efficiency of Alexander's artillery company in battle. He was just 20 years of age. Broadus Mitchell describes just how valuable he proved to be to Washington. Washington read and often corrected or amended letters and documents prepared for his signature, those of Hamilton with the rest. But Hamilton's drafts required little change. Washington and his gifted assistant thought so much alike that Hamilton's composition was frequently indistinguishable from that of his superior. Hamilton became Washington's ready reliance, particularly in moments of pressure. When the British under General Howe defeated Washington's army in Delaware at Brandywine, Alexander quickly sent a warning to the Continental Congress that evacuation of Philadelphia should occur without delay. Washington then assigned him to manage the removal from Philadelphia of as much supplies as possible in the face of strong resistance by the local population. Another defeat of Washington's forces occurred at Germantown, after which Washington established a temporary camp at Whip Pain. It was while this was happening that forces under Horatio Gates, but led principally by Benedict Arnold, defeated the British army under General Burgoyne at Saratoga in New York. Alexander was dispatched to deliver orders to Gates to send some of his force to Washington's assistance. Gates resisted. Other difficulties arose, and to top it off, Alexander came down with an illness that nearly killed him. Washington's army was forced to withdraw and establish winter quarters at Valley Forge. I need not spend time describing the severe hardships experienced by the army encamped in this wilderness region. This was a time of increasing criticism and intrigue directed against Washington. Alexander proved even more valuable to Washington as he was able to communicate in French with the young Marquis de Lafayette. In the spring, the British vacated Philadelphia to return to New York. Alexander joined Lafayette in the field as the Continental Army ready to take on the British at Monmouth in New Jersey. Washington arrived to find troops falling back for no reason and took direct command. At the end of the day, the British had fallen back, escaping from the battlefield during the night. The financial situation of the colonies and their Continental Army was as precarious as conditions on the fields of battle. Alexander was charged by Washington with conveying to the Congress the depth of the problems. His message? Hamilton wrote, "The rapid decay of our currency, the extinction of public spirit, the increasing rapacity of the times, the want of harmony in our councils, the declining zeal of the people, the distresses of the officers of the army are symptoms of a most alarming nature." Washington's next move was to dispatch General John Sullivan against the Iroquois, driving them all the way into Canada, burning their crops and villages along the way. Washington's army needed everything, most critically new troops. Hamilton wrote to John Jay, President of the Continental Congress, encouraging the recruiting of several battalions of enslaved persons because, he argued, quote, "their want of cultivation joined to their habit of subordination enable them sooner to become soldiers than our white inhabitants." The situation then began to improve when the French King Louis XVI sent an army of 6,000 troops under General Rochambeau and a fleet of ships in alliance with the new United States of America. Many, including Alexander, realized that the Continental Congress now needed authority to make decisions affecting national affairs. To James Duane, he wrote, "The Confederation itself is defective and requires to be altered. It is neither fit for war nor peace." His observations on the cause of so many problems continued. The idea of an uncontrollable sovereignty in each state over its internal police will defeat the other powers given to Congress and make our Union feeble and precarious. He continues, "There are instances without number where acts necessary for the general good and which rise out of the powers given to Congress must interfere with the internal police of the states. And there are as many instances in which the particular states, by arrangements of internal police, can effectually, though indirectly, counteract the arrangements of Congress." Elizabeth Schuyler now entered Alexander's life. They met early in 1780 and were married in December. 8 children were born to the couple, and after his death, she never remarried. Alexander next found himself at the center of the effort to prevent the escape of Benedict Arnold from West Point after the discovery of his treachery. At the same time, he felt strong sympathy for the British officer Major Andre, who was executed for his part in the affair. An incident occurred in February of 1781 that temporarily soured the relationship between Alexander and George Washington. Alexander later recalled that the cause was an unavoidable delay in responding to Washington's request for a meeting. Alexander had been in conversation with the Marquis de Lafayette and could not break free to meet with Washington. Broadus Mitchell records that Hamilton, quote, "comes off badly in the incident," adding, "General Washington did all in his power to heal the breach. He generously assured Hamilton of his confidence in the fine qualities of his aide and offered, in a frank conversation, to repair the spat. Hamilton's brilliance did not save him from the unwisdom of youth, false pride, and vanity. He took pleasure in imagining that by refusing to be reconciled, he had subjected the commander-in-chief to humiliation." He now began to devote more of his thinking to the affairs of a peacetime nation, even though the British held on to New York and controlled the coastal regions of the southern colonies. In April 1781, he conveyed his thoughts in a letter to Robert Morris. He wrote, "To me it appears evident that an executive ministry composed of men with the qualifications I have described would speedily restore the credit of government abroad and at home, would induce our allies to greater exertions in our behalf, would inspire confidence in moneyed men in Europe as well as in America to lend us those sums of which it may be demonstrated we stand in need from the disproportion of our national wealth to the expenses of the war." He also provided Morris with an outline for the organization of a national bank and began work on a series of articles calling for a strengthened national government. At the same time, he was anxious to return to the field in command of troops. In early July, he joined Washington and several weeks later was given command of 2 New York regiments. In late August, the army moved south to meet Lord Cornwallis. Alexander's troops then played a leading role in the attack on the British position at Yorktown. With victory achieved and the surrender ceremony completed, he was on the road back to his wife in Albany, New York. He quickly began to work on his ideas for establishing a sound political framework for the new nation. Alexander Hamilton had little faith in laissez-faire or the invisible hand analysis provided by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He also disagreed with the analysis of the French physiocratic writers Quesnay and Turgot and their arguments that public revenue must come from landed property. What the new United States needed to survive, he argued, was government empowered to act to nurture the nation's own manufacturing base and to oversee management of economic affairs. Broadus Mitchell argues that Alexander's motives were enlightened rather than self-serving and not based on any class bias advancing the privilege of some over others. He writes, "The picture of Hamilton, the aristocrat, against Jefferson, the Democrat, is false. Hamilton was solicitous of the well-being of all the people. Historians who ought to know better have said that Hamilton's motives were personal glory and power. It seems not to have occurred to them that his passion was unselfish, that he strove for the welfare of the entire community. The rights of man were Jefferson's noble ideal. Hamilton wished to clothe those rights with material benefits and social responsibilities." Nancy Braden Spanis agrees. She writes, "Without Alexander Hamilton's efforts and ideas, the current Constitution of the United States would not have been adopted, and perhaps there would be no United States at all." As you may have observed, to this point I have referred to the object of this lecture by his first name, Alexander. With the war for independence essentially won, and his military duties coming to a close, Alexander emerges as Hamilton, a figure of prominence and influence, capturing a place at the table where the future course of the nation was to be argued and established. He had not yet completed his law studies when he was recruited by Robert Morris to join him in government as receiver of continental revenue for New York. Hamilton accepted the position conditioned on his ability to continue his law studies. He was not optimistic that much could be done to raise the necessary revenue given the limited powers of the national government. In July of 1781, Robert Morris had written to the governors of each state requesting details on the accounts outstanding between the state and continental government. His intention had been to settle the outstanding balances in an equitable manner. The governors considered the information requested by Morris outside the duties of his office and responded without any commitment to comply. Once Hamilton assumed his new office, he quickly completed an analysis of New York's financial situation and conveyed his findings to Morris. He told Morris, "It is the opinion of the most sensible men with whom I converse that its faculties for revenue are diminished at least 2/3. It will not be difficult to conceive this when we consider that 5 out of 14 counties of which the state was composed, including the capital, are in the hands of the enemy. That 2 and part of a third have revolted, 2 others have been desolated, the greater part by the ravages of the enemy and our own troops, and the remaining 4 have more or less suffered injuries from the same causes. In response, Hamilton put forward a plan to raise needed revenue. This included the taxation of both land and property improvements, what were considered luxury possessions, sales taxes on salt and tobacco, duties on imports, and fees for stamps on legal documents. As one would anticipate, his proposals met with considerable opposition by those in the New York Assembly who would be adversely affected, although the Committee on Finance did agree to a valuation of all land and a small tax imposed based on this valuation. So serious was the financial state of New York that Hamilton sued composed on behalf of a special committee chaired by Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, and addressed to the public creditors of the state of New York that put the fate of the state and the nation in explicit terms. He said, "It cannot be expected that individuals in this country will hereafter lend to the public unless they perceive a disposition to do justice to its creditors. If, without providing for those who have already risked their fortunes, securities should be held out to invite future creditors, a suspicion of their faithful appreciation would deter every prudent man." Continuing, he says, "There must be a good opinion of public faith before there can be a confidence in public securities, and this opinion can only be created by unequivocal demonstrations of a disposition to justice, nor will anything amount to a proof of this short of the measure on which we insist." In recognition of Hamilton's demonstrated understanding of the economic and financial matters facing New York and the nation as a whole, he was elected for a one-year term as delegate to the Continental Congress beginning in November of 1782. He stepped down from his position working for Robert Morris and prepared himself to take on the challenge of convincing his fellow delegates to support the systemic changes he concluded were absolutely essential. What he found when he took his seat in Philadelphia was a legislative body plagued by insufficient attendance, so much so that the passage of legislation was frequently delayed. Broadus Mitchell offers this insight into the situation. Certain competent scholars have offered a more favorable view of the accomplishments of the Confederation Congress, but all their ingenuity is required to show positive gains. Anyone who reads the journals must be thankful that military victory did not drive the country into political calamity and credit collapse. Still, the nation's financial situation was extremely precarious. In accord with the Articles of Confederation, ratified in March 1781, Congress began annually requesting that the states collect and fulfill quotas of the sums needed to pay ongoing wartime expenses. The taxes the states collected were almost entirely direct taxes, property and poll taxes, which became increasingly burdensome as the war went on. Making matters worse, since the continental currency no longer circulated and specie was scarce, there was a shortage of currency with which to pay taxes. Many taxes were paid in goods. The compliance rate on these congressional quotas from the states was roughly 50% in 1781 and 1782. For the rest, the Congress had to borrow, which largely amounted to Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance, writing promissory notes on his own credit. What Hamilton proposed in this congressional session was a 5% import duty, the revenue to be devoted to payment of the interest accruing on the nation's war debt to creditors. Rhode Island and Georgia opposed the measure. Even after Hamilton gained the assent of the Rhode Island delegates, the governor and the state legislature continued their opposition based on Rhode Island's dependency on commercial trade rather than agricultural production. The delegates voted to send a delegation to Rhode Island to make the case for the import duty to the Rhode Island legislature. They were on the road when news was received that Virginia and possibly Maryland were repealing their acts of accession. Other sources of revenue would have to be found to meet interest payments on the debt and other expenses, including payment of overdue wages to those in an increasingly restless army. The Articles of Confederation required that each state contribute to the national revenue in proportion to the value of their lands. Hamilton and Madison argued this was a prescription for conflict. If each state did the valuation, their self-interest would be to come to a much lower than actual value. At the same time, the federal government had neither the financial nor the technical resources to do the valuation. When John Rutledge of South Carolina urged reconsideration of the 5% duty on imports, Hamilton this time expressed opposition on the grounds that it discriminated against domestic creditors. The debate over national finances seemed to be back to square one, with no solution at hand. Remarkably, Hamilton urged George Washington to put the Army in motion to pressure the state legislatures to come up with the necessary funds. Washington wanted no part in such an action. He countered with a proposal that the Congress adjourn and individual members return home to campaign for the needed federal authority. Broadus Mitchell quotes Washington's communication back to Hamilton. For it is clearly my opinion, unless Congress have powers competent to all general purposes, that the distresses we have encountered, the expenses we have incurred, and the blood we have spilt in the course of an 8 years' war will avail us nothing. Despite Washington's actions, the Army came close on its own to taking action. Washington notified Hamilton and then did his best to get his officers to act with restraint. Then on the 30th of November, the signed preliminary treaty of peace arrived. Thanks to Washington's efforts, the Army merely petitioned the government for what was due and waited. When nothing happened as the months went by, hundreds of soldiers finally lost patience and marched into Philadelphia, commanded by their sergeants. They surrounded the State House on the 20th of June, 1783. A stalemate lasted for several days until the Congress adjourned and quietly moved to Princeton. When Continental Army troops under the command of General Robert Howe approached the city, the mutineers surrendered and dispersed. Hamilton put his recommendations into a statement with the intention of introducing a resolution that Congress called for a convention to amend the Articles. However, there were too few delegates present at the time, and Hamilton's tenure as a delegate was ending. He was now 29 years of age. Returned to Albany, he began his law practice by taking on cases arising under the anti-loyalist statutes of New York. Hamilton began representing individuals whose property was confiscated after the signing of the peace treaty, the terms of which stipulated no such actions would be taken against the persons or property of loyalists. He also represented New York State in a dispute with Massachusetts over western lands, that is, the region west of the Hudson River. The boundary issues were not fully resolved until 1788. Peace brought with it a return to normalcy of sorts and a return to commercial activity. To support business and commerce beyond barter, the markets needed a financial intermediary, a bank. Robert Livingston came up with a plan for a land bank. Hamilton took the lead against this plan on the basis that first, it would establish a monopoly in the state, and second, 2/3 of the bank's assets would be shares in companies formed to speculate in frontier lands and mortgage liens on land, considered by Hamilton to be risky non-liquid assets. Hamilton's plan for a new Bank of New York required that 1/2 of the bank's financial capital take the form of gold or silver coinage. Moreover, the charter required that, quote, all payments and receipts should be in gold or silver coin or banknotes only. The bank would make short-term loans only and do business with merchants and manufacturers known to be prudent and conservative. Hamilton owned just one share in the bank, remaining a director until 1788, when he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury. One indication of Hamilton's character is his opposition to the enslavement of other human beings. In 1785, he became a founding member of the New York Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves and Protecting Such of Them as Have Been or May be Liberated. John Jay served as the first president of this organization. Upon re-election to the New York Assembly, Hamilton joined with others, urging the legislature to end the slave trade. The fragile state of the economies of most states eroded as the year 1785 progressed. As the war was ending, many prominent people borrowed heavily to speculate in land, certain that population would begin to move into the new open frontier territories as Congress enacted the Land Ordinance that year. Intensifying armed resistance from the tribal peoples delayed this western movement, and the speculators defaulted on loans. Actual farmers faced similar debt problems when crop prices fell or harvests were impacted by too much or too little rain or other uncontrollable problems. Farmers in western Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, rose up against foreclosures for non-payment of taxes. This army of former Revolutionary War soldiers were owed back wages and heavily burdened with debt and delinquent taxes. The conflict escalated, and the state governor hired over 4,000 men under General Benjamin Lincoln to put down the insurgency. Shays sought to take the federal armory in Springfield, but was turned back after a brief fight. Many of the insurgents left the state and found refuge in Vermont until pardoned later in 1787 by John Hancock, the newly elected governor. Facing the reality of the circumstances of the frontier farmers, the new legislature enacted a moratorium on debts and cut taxes. Momentum for reform of the Articles of Confederation quickly advanced. Hamilton and one other New Yorker were commissioned to participate in a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, with commissioners from the other states to discuss commercial issues affecting relations between the states. The meeting began early in September with 5 states, New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey, represented. 4 other states sent delegates, but none arrived in time. No decisions could be reached. However, the commissioners in attendance agreed to recommend that a convention be called to revise the Articles of Confederation. Back home in New York City, Hamilton picked up his efforts to repeal laws aimed at penalizing former Loyalists. In this, he was partly successful. He got the Assembly in Albany to grant independence to Vermont, although the Senate stood firm in opposition. He tried to get tax reform legislation passed, but this also failed. And he got the Assembly and Senate to agree to send 3 delegates to what became the Constitutional Convention. Finally, the meeting to consider amendments to the Articles of Confederation was set to begin the last week of May 1787. For several weeks, Hamilton contributed very little to the proceedings. Then, on the 18th of June, he delivered a long statement of his own ideas, which he said would serve as the basis for moving amendments to what others might propose. He challenged the Virginia plan as insufficient to repair the deficiencies under the Articles, and he outright rejected the New Jersey plan because it left the sovereignty of the states essentially intact. Here, Hamilton's admiration for a strong national government is expressed, as he wrote, "I believe the British government forms the best model the world ever produced. This government has for its object public strength and individual security." He described the House of Lords as a noble institution and a permanent barrier against every pernicious innovation. He went on to argue the case that one branch of the legislature should hold their offices for life, or at least during good behavior. The executive should also hold this office for life, he argued. As the debate advanced, Hamilton softened and sought compromise. Broadus Mitchell offers some insight into how Hamilton tried to stimulate debate as a means of reaching consensus. Though Hamilton's ideal scheme appeared outlandish to most of his fellow delegates, by benefit of his concessions later, much that he recommended was engrafted in the Constitution. A principal innovation of the document was that it empowered the national government to act directly upon the individual citizen without the mediation of the state. The final day of the convention came on the 17th of September. Benjamin Franklin, too ill to speak, had his address read by James Wilson. He set the tone of the state-by-state debates over ratification. I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects which I once thought right but found to be otherwise. Hamilton came to very much the same position. His task, with help from others, was to explain the new Constitution to the people of New York and the other states to the extent possible. The result was a comprehensive series of 85 articles written by Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, all signed Publius and titled The Federalist. An opinion of the significance of the Federalist is offered by Benjamin Fletcher Wright, editor of a 1961 edition of the Essays. He writes, "The Federalist was not designed to be a systematic treatise on political and constitutional philosophy, in which such topics as the nature and the origins of the state and government, the nature of law, sovereignty, the grounds of political obligation, or the reasons for obedience to constituted authority, and the scope and limitations of political power are carefully and dispassionately examined. Yet the Federalist, tract for the time though it is, better repays analysis of its political and constitutional ideas than any other book written in America." When New Hampshire's state constitutional convention voted to ratify the new federal constitution, Hamilton's hopes for the future were certainly encouraged. New York City would continue as a temporary location for the government. The procedure for election of a president and a vice president under the new Constitution identified one of the issues that needed to be rectified by amendment. A practical question arose because there was a possibility, remote as it might be, that John Adams might receive more votes in the Electoral College than George Washington. Hamilton used his influence to urge that some electors vote for candidates other than Adams to prevent an unanticipated result. As George Washington settled into the presidency and began the process of creating the executive branch, the cabinet position of Secretary of the Treasury loomed large. Consulting with Robert Morris, now a senator, Morris had only one person to commend, Hamilton. Hamilton was nominated on the 11th of September and approved by the Senate the same day. Now it was Hamilton's challenge to staff the Treasury with competent people and see to the efficient administration of the nation's finances. Controls at the nation's ports of entry became a top priority to fully collect import duties and prevent smuggling. Hamilton read everything he could access on public finance and worked to implement what he found to be best practices that worked elsewhere. Oliver Wolcott Jr. came on as auditor and performed with great competence. William Duer became assistant secretary, but was very soon forced to resign for engaging in speculation in public securities. The U.S. House of Representatives adopted a resolution directing the Secretary of the Treasury to prepare and deliver a report on the nation's finances to the next session of Congress. By mid-January, Hamilton's report was ready. Speculators were also ready. Anticipating the government would assume the war debts of the states, they had purchased huge quantities of state securities at deeply discounted prices from those who had no idea of what was about to occur. Thus, Hamilton's decision to acquire the securities at face value created his first serious political storm. The securities were transferable. Hamilton argued the government must honor the terms of the contracts. However, holders of securities who agreed to concessions would be given preference on when payment would occur. New securities would be issued and sold in an amount equal to the total amount of current outstanding debt, including all war debts of the states. Creditors would also have the opportunity to purchase Western lands at 20 cents per acre. Meeting the financial obligations of the new government posed both practical and conceptual problems. Heavy taxation to pay for the French and Indian War had pushed Britain's colonial subjects into a war for independence. The war had been a long and costly endeavor, and creditors were waiting to be repaid. Taxing imports raised revenue, but sparked retaliatory measures against exports. Legislatures were dominated by property interests not very receptive to taxing themselves. What was left? The answer is provided by Broadus Mitchell. He says, then there was the favorite vague optimism that sales of Western lands would suffice to clear the debt. Selling off the newly acquired public domain was at the time not particularly controversial, but the amount of revenue to be raised would be insignificant in comparison to the nation's debt obligations. The intense disagreements over how to raise public revenue and how to service public debt had one very long-lasting consequence, as Broadus Mitchell explains. The debate on Hamilton's fiscal policies in Congress and the country marked the birth of political parties in America. What made Hamilton so powerful was his understanding of what would move the major stakeholders in the nation to take the actions he knew to be necessary. Charles Beard, in his seminal and controversial dissertation, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, provides an insightful profile of Hamilton's psychology. Beard writes, "It was he who saw most keenly the precise character of the social groups which would have to be rallied to the new government in order to draw support away from the states and give the federal system a firm foundation. He saw, in the first place, that the most easily consolidated and timorous group was composed of the creditors, the financiers, bankers, and moneylenders. He saw that by identifying their interests with those of the new government, the latter would be secure. They would not desert the ship in which they were all afloat." He goes on, "It is charged against him that he did not buy up government paper in behalf of the public at the most favorable terms, but to have done so would have diminished the profits of the very financiers whose goodwill was necessary to the continuance of the government." At this stage of the debates, Hamilton's arguments that all holders of federal securities must be fully satisfied was opposed by James Madison, who sided with others who argued that speculators should not be so rewarded. Nonetheless, Hamilton's proposal was approved and implemented. A solution to Hamilton's proposal for the federal government to assume the war debts of the states was to be more difficult. Some states had incurred far higher levels of debt than others. Shays' Rebellion indicated what might happen in any state that sought to impose direct taxes on citizens. Hamilton's compromise was to exempt lands, houses, livestock, and farm produce from federal taxation. Instead, import duties would be increased on sugar, molasses, spices, salt, spirits, and tobacco products, and certain luxury items. When the measure went to the full House of Representatives, other issues clouded adoption of Hamilton's compromise plan. Quakers and others argued for the prohibition of the slave trade. Representatives from states that had already repaid much of their war debt declared their opposition. Threats of civil war were voiced. In the end, Southern legislators agreed to support Hamilton's program in return for a commitment to move the nation's capital to the Potomac. The final bill was passed by the Congress on the 4th of August, 1790. Hamilton had already forewarned the Congress that a proposal would soon be coming to establish a national bank. His report was submitted to the House of Representatives in mid-December 1790. After careful study, Hamilton explained the advantages he believed existed in establishing a national bank, while acknowledging the problems such banks could create if not closely regulated and scrutinized. Hamilton's report makes no mention of the one bank in modern history that functioned as a depository bank, namely the Bank of Amsterdam. Yet he fully accepts the need for deposits of foreign minted gold and silver coinage then circulating as backing for paper notes issued and circulating as currency, at least until the country had established its own mint. With this principle established, he then states the case for a system of fractional reserves. He writes, "It is a well-established fact that banks in good credit can circulate a far greater sum than the actual quantum of their capital in gold and silver. The extent of the possible excess seems indeterminate, though it has been conjecturally stated at the propositions of 2 and 3 to 1. The Senate quickly passed the enabling legislation. The debate in the House of Representatives followed along sectional interests. Northern commercial states in favor, Southern agrarian states opposed. Madison's views were expressed in one of the contributions to the Federalist Papers. As he stated, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in state governments are numerous and indefinite." Thus, Madison opposed the bank on the grounds that the Constitution made no provision for such an incorporated agency of government. After long and what Broadus Mitchell describes as repetitious debate, the vote was 39 to 20 in favor of the bank. Hamilton's response, historians note, was in part based on powers implied in the Constitution. Hamilton's detailed responses and argument persuaded George Washington, who signed the bill into law on the 4th of July, 1791. Almost immediately, all of the shares in the bank were sold. The bank began operations at Philadelphia and Carpenter's Hall, while its permanent home was being constructed, completing in 1795. The need by the United States for its own coinage became the next priority for Hamilton. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison expressed strong opinions on how to proceed. One of Hamilton's major concerns was that the new U.S. coins would exchange as close to par as possible with the Spanish dollar or the coinage of the country's main trading partners, Britain, Holland, and France. The result was coinage containing a 15 to 1 ratio of silver to gold. Legislation was passed by the Congress in April of 1792 establishing the mint to be located at the seat of the government of the United States, with responsibility for regulating the nation's coinage. A new building was authorized to be constructed in Philadelphia, and David Rittenhouse was appointed as the mint's first director. On the 5th of December, 1791, Hamilton's report on manufactures was submitted to the Congress. There it sat for some time. In the report, he expressed his view that government assistance would be required to encourage the formation of firms engaged in the production of manufactured goods. This was no more than trying to create a level playing field, given the self-interest practiced by every nation. He wrote, "It is a primary object of the policy of nations to be able to supply themselves with subsistence from their own soils, and manufacturing nations, as far as circumstances permit, endeavor to procure from the same source the raw materials necessary for their own fabrics. This disposition, urged by the spirit of monopoly, is sometimes even carried to an injudicious extreme. It seems not always to be recollected that nations who have neither mines nor manufactures can only obtain the manufactured articles of which they stand in need by an exchange of the products of their soils, and that, if those who can best furnish them with such articles are unwilling to give a due course to this exchange, they must of necessity make every possible effort to manufacture for themselves, the effect of which is that the manufacturing nations abridge the natural advantages of their situation, through an unwillingness to permit the agricultural countries to enjoy the advantages of theirs, and sacrifice the interests of a mutually beneficial intercourse to the vain project of selling everything and buying nothing." What then should be the response of government in the United States? Hamilton examined all the options. He writes, A full view having now been taken of the inducements to the promotion of manufacturers in the United States, accompanied with an examination of the principal objections which are commonly urged in opposition, it is proper in the next place to consider the means by which it may be effected, as introductory to a specification of the objects which in the present state of things appear the most fit to be encouraged, and of the particular measures which it may be advisable to adopt in respect to each. Hamilton advised the Congress to provide funding for infrastructure, to create good roads, canals, and navigable rivers that would put the remote parts of a country more nearly upon a level with those in the neighborhood of the town. These and other measures would encourage population growth, encourage investment, and generate a dynamic and resilient economy. Much had been accomplished under George Washington's leadership despite the growing political divisiveness in the country. Anti-Federalist forces, with Aaron Burr as a central figure and now a U.S. Senator, were anxious to push back and to use whatever means they could to discredit Hamilton. An opportunity would arise with the discovery that Hamilton had become romantically involved with a woman named Maria Reynolds. Another controversy for Hamilton arose when it was revealed that beginning in 1789, Hamilton had engaged in a clandestine correspondence with George Beckwith, a major in the British Army, with the objective of influencing U.S. foreign policy in the direction he deemed to be in the best interest of the United States. Such matters rightfully fell under the province of Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, and Jefferson continued to see France at this early stage of its own revolution as the nation's friend and, if it came to war, ally. With the presidential election of 1792, opponents of Hamilton saw an opportunity to diminish his influence by electing George Clinton of New York as vice president, sending John Adams home to Massachusetts. Clinton could not generate the necessary support, and John Adams was returned for a second term as vice president. The campaigning for office was almost always in some sense dominated by attempted character assassination, as is the case today. However, once the votes were counted and the results announced, those who were elected turned their focus onto the business of governance. This is described well in just a few sentences by historians Edward L. and Frederick H. Schapmeyer. The adversary confrontation between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson symbolized not only a contest between parties, but it also signified the beginning of the American political tradition. A synthesis of ideas took place along with a readiness to compromise, which gave birth to a non-ideologically oriented political system. Liberal and conservative heirs of this mode of idealism, have been receptive to reform and change while simultaneously seeking to maintain continuity with the past. Washington's cabinet remained intact as he began his second term of office. Despite the attacks on both Hamilton and Jefferson by opposing factions, their working relationship seemed unaffected. At the same time, however, Hamilton was chagrined over the withdrawal of agreement and support coming from James Madison. He expressed these concerns in a letter to Edward Carrington, dated the 26th of May, 1792. It was not till the last session that I became unequivocally convinced of the following truth, that Mr. Madison cooperating with Mr. Jefferson is at the head of a faction decidedly hostile to me and my administration, and actuated by views, in my judgment, subversive of the principles of good government and dangerous to the Union, peace, and happiness of the country. These are strong expressions. They may pain your friendship for one or both of the gentlemen whom I have named. I have not lightly resolved to hazard them. They are the result of a serious alarm in my mind for the public welfare, and of a full conviction that what I have alleged is a truth, and a truth which ought to be told and well attended to by all the friends of union and efficient national government. As the disagreements over policy between Hamilton and Jefferson intensified, George Washington intervened in an effort to ease tensions between his two advisors. However, Jefferson and Madison decided they must do something to drive Hamilton from office and enlisted the support of Virginia Representative William Branch Giles and other Republicans. In 1895, the editor of Jefferson's papers announced discovery of Jefferson's rough draft of what became the Giles censure resolutions. Historian Eugene Sheridan offers this insight into Jefferson's reasons. Jefferson's overt participation in the attack on Hamilton stemmed from an accumulation of classical Republican ideological apprehensions about diplomatic disagreements with and personal antagonism toward the Treasury Secretary and the system he represented. These concerns converged with explosive force at the end of 1792. By then, Jefferson had long been convinced that his vision of a virtuous agrarian republic was jeopardized by Hamilton's grand design of creating, under the auspices of a strong central government, a tightly integrated nation based on the support of public creditors and marked by what Jefferson regards as British forms of social and political corruption. Fast-moving events across the Atlantic Ocean intensified the stresses of domestic political differences. The Marquis de Lafayette, the one Frenchman held in the highest esteem by Americans in the United States, had escaped arrest in August of 1792 by entering the Austrian Netherlands, where he was taken prisoner. Many in the U.S. were shocked when the French King Louis XVI was executed on the 21st of January, 1793. The French revolutionary government then declared war on Great Britain and the Netherlands. Even Thomas Paine, in France to help guide the French toward a democratic republic, was arrested and scheduled to be executed as a foreigner and enemy of the revolution. While Hamilton was working to restructure the nation's debt in order to fully repay the French, his actions were interpreted by Jefferson as having the exact opposite objective. Hamilton rose to his own defense during February, delivering comprehensive reports to the House of Representatives and defending his decision to seek new loans to restructure debt as within the intent of acts passed by the Congress in 1790. Despite a good deal of ambiguity over the legality, if not the intent, of Hamilton's actions, Jefferson urged his Republican colleagues to press the issue forward in anticipation of the discovery of misuse of public funds, forcing Washington to dismiss Hamilton. Washington rejected Jefferson's call for an investigation of the Treasury by the Attorney General, prompting Jefferson to initiate censure resolutions coming from the House of Representatives. What Jefferson did not know is that Washington had approved all the actions taken by Hamilton. Jefferson's actions were taken knowing full well that the resolutions had no chance of adoption in the Federalist-dominated House. The United States was being pulled into the European drama with no easy way out. The French had dispatched Edmund Charles Genet to the United States, charged with obtaining American assistance against Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson was sympathetic. Hamilton was not. George Washington called for neutrality and directed the French government to recall Genet. Before this could be acted upon, a French privateer had been refitted in Philadelphia, slipped out to sea, and then began attacking British shipping. Tensions mounted between all three nations. For Thomas Jefferson, the time had come to finally take the step he had been anxious to take for some time, to resign as Secretary of State and return to Monticello and take care of his private affairs. He had expressed his intentions to George Washington in 1791. To William Short, at the beginning of 1792, he had written of his decision to retire early in 1793. Given what we know about his financial affairs, none of this ought to be of a surprise. Washington was able to persuade him several times to postpone his departure, but finally Jefferson submitted his resignation on the 31st of December and departed. From the standpoint of his personal interest, retirement to Monticello should have been a permanent step. In France, the radical Jacobins gained power and recalled Genet, who essentially sought asylum in the United States, expecting he would be arrested, put on trial, and executed by the Jacobins. Washington pressed for the Congress to pass a neutrality bill, which they did on the 4th of June, 1794. None of the European belligerents honored U.S. neutrality. During the fall, privateers brought their prizes into U.S. ports. The vessels were quietly and illegally refitted for warfare and returned to the sea. Domestically, Hamilton was forced to take action against the uprising in the frontier counties of Pennsylvania, where citizens refused to pay the excise tax on farmers and whiskey distillers. Small producers were taxed much higher per gallon than large producers, and many farmers relied on whiskey as currency in exchange for needed goods. George Washington, accompanied by Hamilton, rode to the frontier, taking command of about 3,000 Pennsylvania and New Jersey militia. Representatives from the western counties met them at Carlisle, informing the president the people were ready to submit to the laws. Not persuaded, Washington marched the militia into the region and rounded up suspected leaders. The actual leaders had already escaped. Eventually, only 2 men were found guilty of treason, both pardoned by Washington. Upon their return to Philadelphia, Hamilton notified Washington of his intent to resign as Secretary of the Treasury on the last day of January, 1795. Tension and animosity between Great Britain and the United States had continued since the end of the war because of Britain's continued occupancy of forts on territory the treaty had transferred to the United States. British agents had continued to provide weapons and munitions to the tribal peoples on the frontier, encouraging them to harass settlers moving into the territory. Hamilton did all he could to generate political support for a new treaty with Britain that would resolve as many outstanding points of conflict as possible. In commercial matters, Hamilton used the statistics compiled at the Treasury to show that trade with Britain and Britain's dominions was far more valuable than that with France. In writing and in discussion, he went back and forth with Jefferson and Madison over every aspect of the nation's relations with the 2 European powers. Finally, John Jay was selected to travel to Britain to negotiate the treaty. Washington instructed Jay to demand that Great Britain withdraw its troops from the United States northwestern territories. Additionally, Britain was to compensate slaveholders for slaves British soldiers had abducted during the Revolutionary War, pay ship owners for trading vessels seized by Britain's naval forces, and permit free trade between the United States and the British West Indies. Jay achieved only a limited success, however, gaining the withdrawal of troops and compensation to American merchants. He failed to obtain protections for American shipping or reimbursements for stolen slaves, and he prematurely conceded Americans' responsibility to pay British merchants for pre-Revolutionary War debts. Jay's treaty contained provisions that some considered humiliating to the United States, but President Washington sent it to the Senate for formal approval, arguing that Jay had obtained the best possible deal and that the nation could ill afford another war with Britain. Washington charged Hamilton with providing analysis of each article's strengths and weaknesses. What Hamilton produced was put before the public in newspaper essays signed Camillus. In December, the Senate voted to recommend approval, and Washington signed the treaty. Republicans in the House of Representatives threatened not to approve the funds necessary to carry out the treaty. However, when a vote was taken days later, the appropriation was narrowly approved. In July of 1795, Hamilton received a letter from William Bradford asking him to consider nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court to fill the seat vacated by the resignation of John Jay. Bradford's appeal to Hamilton's sense of public duty transcends time. He wrote, "Your squabbles in New York have taken our Chief Justice from us. Ought you not to find us another? I am afraid that department, as it relates neither to war, finance, nor negotiation, has no charms for you, and yet, when one considers how immensely important it is, where they have the power of paralyzing the measures of the government by declaring a law unconstitutional, it is not to be trusted to men who are to be scared by popular clamor or warped by feeble-minded prejudices. I wish to heaven you would permit me to name you. Hamilton's aspirations were elsewhere. As Broadus Mitchell writes, quote, Hamilton was destined for action. He willingly responded to frequent requests from his successor at Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, for advice. If anything, George Washington continued to look even more frequently for the opinions of Hamilton on the affairs of state. Washington was struggling to rebuild a severely depleted cabinet. Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, and Randolph had all resigned. William Bradford, Attorney General, died in August of 1795. Oliver Wolcott Jr., with continued support from Hamilton, was serving Washington well as Secretary of the Treasury. Timothy Pickering succeeded Henry Knox in January of 1795 as Secretary of War, but remained for just 1 year, when he was succeeded by James McHenry. The position of Attorney General remained open after Bradford's death for 4 months, until filled by Charles Lee. Hamilton, now in private law practice, had no shortage of petitioners for his representation in legal matters. Another attorney, Robert Troup, invited Hamilton to join a group of investors speculating in land located in the wilderness of New York. Hamilton was already an owner of some western lands and declined the offer. Broadus Mitchell notes that the land he held did not bring him any material gain during his lifetime. More importantly, his long years of public service had not resulted in a strong financial position. He needed to practice law to earn enough to pay off his own debts. And of course, when Washington made his decision not to stand for election to a third term as president, he sought Hamilton's assistance in the preparation of his farewell address. In an assessment of what Washington, Hamilton, and the others had accomplished, Broadus Mitchell offers this. Subsequent generations forgot the domestic dissensions and foreign perplexities which informed the president's rich advice, but were enduringly impressed by the admonitions of harmony at home and goodwill toward, but not permanent alliances with, foreign nations. 150 years later, many in America, including those in highest office, were ready to discard the advice of patriots of the 18th century. Washington offered hope and caution to his fellow citizens, and in the end he remained a humble servant to the nation. His words expressed very much the sentiments of Hamilton. Though in reviewing the incidents of my administration I am unconscious of intentional error, I am nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. Whatever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. Hamilton had moved on, but one part of his recent past now caught up with him, his affair with Maria Reynolds, about which he had made several blackmail payments to the woman's husband. The affair and fabricated accusation of Hamilton having speculated in government securities were revealed by James T. Callender. Hamilton countered with the kind of detailed and documented response as was his practice in all matters, a pamphlet published on the 31st of August, 1797. Hamilton's opponents could offer no real evidence of Hamilton's alleged speculations, and the scandal faded from public attention. Across the Atlantic, the Old World monarchies were hard-pressed by the battlefield successes of the French army, now commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte. Yet, when Napoleon overreached trying to expand the French Empire into the Middle East in 1798, an opportunity to remove the French threat brought Austria, Britain, Turkey, and Russia together. The French forces were driven out of the Italian peninsula in 1799. Returning to France, Napoleon led a coup that brought him dictatorial power. All through this period, the relationship between the United States and France hung in a precarious state of quasi-war. After the signing of the Jay Treaty between the United States and Great Britain, the French government authorized privateers to conduct attacks on U.S. shipping. As the loss of merchant ships mounted, the U.S. retaliated. The French Foreign Minister Talleyrand demanded a bribe be paid by envoys sent by John Adams in return for an audience with him. Eventually, Talleyrand dropped this and other conditions, but did not agree that France would end the seizures of U.S. ships. As the sea battles threatened to expand to land, Adams looked to George Washington to once again take command of the army. One of Washington's conditions was that Hamilton be appointed second in command. Hamilton called for a massive increase in the number of ships of the line, construction of defensive positions to protect the nation's main ports, and the raising of 12 additional active regiments. As the situation deteriorated, Adams was moving in favor of an alliance with Great Britain. In France, Talleyrand remained as foreign minister and reopened negotiation with the United States. A three-man commission was dispatched to France, and negotiations resulted in the Convention of 1800, which terminated the 1778 Treaty of Alliance between the two nations. De-escalation of the conflict with both France and Great Britain was ultimately the best outcome for the United States. Hamilton, essentially on his own, took to the challenge of rebuilding the nation's defensive forces. As he communicated to George Washington, the nation was ill-prepared for war. He wrote, "McHenry is wholly insufficient for his place, Secretary of War, with the additional misfortune of not having the least suspicion of the fact. I more and more apprehend that obstacles of a very peculiar kind stand in the way of an efficient and successful management." With a tentative peace established, Hamilton resurrected Washington's urging of a permanent training program for military officers. The plan put forward by Hamilton to the Secretary of War McHenry is summarized by Broadus Mitchell. Mitchell writes, "The Academy should have a fundamental school in which all students spend 2 years learning mathematics, mechanics, geography, and tactics. Then followed a period in one of 4 specialized branches: artillery and engineering, 2 years, cavalry, navy, 1 year each. The site should permit of an artillery range and be on navigable water suitable for ship construction. A cannon foundry and small arms manufactory operated by Army detachments would furnish object lessons for the students." The land at West Point was acquired in 1790 from General Stephen Moore of North Carolina for the sum of $11,085. The garrison's defenses had been constructed beginning in 1778 under the direction of Polish engineer Tadeusz Kosciuszko. The academy was established in 1802, with 2 students completing the program that year. Hamilton's political future was far from certain and suffered with the death of George Washington in December of 1799. Passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798 raised public animosity toward John Adams and the Federalists generally. In his own state of New York, the Federalist candidates were badly defeated in 1799, a strong indication that Thomas Jefferson would emerge as the next president. Hamilton's regrettable partisan strategy was to attempt to have the law changed, quote, "to take the choice of electors away from the new legislature and give it to the people voting in districts." In what is considered by historians as a grave political mistake, Hamilton chose to put his concerns about the ability of John Adams to govern before the public just before the election of 1800. There has since then been debate about just how much harm this did to the president's bid for re-election. Thanks to the rules established for the Electoral College, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr ended with the same number of votes. A common observation made by historians was repeated by historian Herbert Sloan in 2004. Sloan writes, convinced that Jefferson was the less dangerous of the two, Hamilton now did everything in his power to persuade his fellow Federalists not to vote for Burr, writing letter after letter to convince them that, however unpalatable they found Jefferson, Burr was 1,000 times worse. And as Broadus Mitchell assesses the outcome of the election, Hamilton had more to be pleased about than he could have anticipated. Jefferson did not upset the national apple cart. He began his administration with the Louisiana Purchase, which was in the Federalist spirit. He conformed to several Federalist tenets. America's condition was mostly determined by fortunes in Europe, not here. Nothing could have prepared Hamilton for what soon occurred, the death of his eldest son, Philip, in a duel with a supporter of Thomas Jefferson named George Eaker. Philip took offense to aspersions on the Federalist record made by Eaker in a 4th of July oration, taunted him into a fight, and was shot dead. However, personal tragedy did not prevent Hamilton from devoting his energies to the elimination of flaws he saw in the U.S. Constitution and structure of government. He urged support for the separate election of candidates for president and vice president. He continued to argue that electors be chosen by people in districts under the direction of Congress. As the year 1804 began, Hamilton found himself immersed in the campaign to elect a new governor for the state of New York. Aaron Burr and Morgan Lewis were both running as Republicans, while the Federalists fielded no one. Hamilton did what he could do to encourage Federalists to vote for Lewis, and Lewis won the state by a significant margin. Burr's anger took the form of a letter to Hamilton presenting evidence that Hamilton had engaged in character assassination. Unsatisfactory exchanges occurred, and Burr extended his challenge. Broadus Mitchell recounts the rest. Hamilton, to outward appearance nothing perturbed, a week before the duel called on William Short to request the pleasure of his company at a family dinner in the country on Saturday next 3 o'clock. Hamilton made his will, penned for his executors a list of his liabilities, wrote farewell letters to his wife, left a grateful note for his friend Pendleton, and drew up an explanation of his motives in meeting Burr. Their famous duel was fought on the 11th of July. Hamilton was mortally wounded and died the following day. He was just 47 years old. Hamilton left behind a wife, 2 daughters, and 5 sons. After his death, friends subscribed to raise funds sufficient to settle his debts and to ensure the family could maintain their home in the Harlem district of New York City. Richard Brookhiser is just one of many who wonders about the deeper loss associated with Hamilton's death, the loss to the further growth of the Republic. He writes, biography ends with death, but when a man is killed in middle age, it is tempting to imagine what he might have done had he lived out his natural lifespan. Hamilton would have opposed the secessionists. The Boston meeting was canceled after he was killed, but the movement probably would have collapsed under the weight of Burr's frivolity and Pickering's seriousness without him. In an era of Republican dominance, public office could never have returned to him, even if he had sought it. His best work probably would have been done as a lawyer. The landmark cases of the next decades that used his arguments, Fletcher versus Peck, McCulloch versus Maryland, might have been argued by him in person. An important legacy of Hamilton's long intellectual and philosophical conflict with James Madison and Thomas Jefferson is captured by philosopher Mortimer J. Adler. Never resolved, in fact, is the original intent behind the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution. As Adler writes, in the vocabulary of traditional political theory, the distinction between limited and unlimited government is identical with the distinction between constitutional and absolute or despotic government. A constitutional government is, by its very nature, always a limited government because the power exercised by its office holders is limited to the authority conferred by the Constitution on the offices they hold. An absolute monarch ruling despotically is not an office holder and is not subject to such limitations. And with that quote from Mortimer Adler, I end this presentation on the life and accomplishments of Alexander Hamilton. Thank you.